Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our panel on representation in proximity. So my name is Jen Humke, and I'm a senior program officer in the Journalism and Media program at the MacArthur Foundation. And for those of you who don't know, we're a private philanthropic institution based in Chicago in the United States, and we make grants on a range of issues all around the globe, including journalism and media. And some of you may know that we very recently launched a new initiative to support local news in the US. And I'm gonna be your moderator today. Really happy to be here. So in the next 50 minutes, we're gonna be hearing from an incredible panel of experts who are changing the way news is being reported at the local level. So they're elevating new voices, they're shifting the ways we're thinking about audiences, and in doing so, they're really reinvigorating the civic role that journalism plays and building trust in the media. So all three of these panelists are women founders of innovative newsrooms that redefine local and reimagine the power of local journalism. Because our time is limited, the plan that I hope to carry out today is I'm gonna do a very quick introduction of the three panelists, then they're gonna say a little bit about each of their organizations just to provide some context for you. We're gonna jump into a Q&A up here for about a half an hour, and I promise to leave at least 10 minutes for all of you to ask questions before we break at 50 minutes. Okay, so I'm gonna start first with Cristi. So Cristi Hegranes is the CEO of Global Press, the nonprofit news organization she founded in 2006 to train and employ local women journalists in some of the world's least covered places. Her values-driven approach to journalism prioritizes newsroom representation and journalist security. Thanks for being here, Cristi.
Thank you.
Next to Cristi is Akoto Ofori-Atta. Akoto is co-founder and chief audience officer of Capital B, a local and national nonprofit news organization serving Black Americans. Akoto steers audience and community engagement strategies that get meaningful and accessible journalism to Black audiences. She collaborates with co-founder and CEO Lauren Williams to develop all aspects of the business, from operations to editorial strategy to newsroom culture. So thanks for being here, Akoto. And then on the other side of Akoto, we have Yukari Kane. So Yukari is Prison Journalism Project's co-founder and serves as Chief Executive Officer and Editor-in-Chief. She's an author, educator, and veteran journalist with more than 20 years of experience as a staff writer and foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and Reuters. Yukari, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So let's start with you, Cristi, if you could say a little bit about Global Press.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So as Jen said, Global Press has been around for 18 years now, and over the last 18 years, we have trained and employed hundreds of women in some of the most least covered parts of the world, ranging from southern Mexico to Mongolia to Democratic Republic of Congo. Our approach is to build representative newsrooms in each of these places, and then train our reporters to produce high-quality feature news reporting that's produced both in their local language and also an English language product on topics that you just won't find in other news media.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with y'all. Capital B was founded in 2022, and we do local and national reporting for Black communities across the country. We have 2 local newsrooms and a national newsroom. Our local newsrooms are in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Gary, Indiana. And we cover criminal justice, politics, education, health, and all the issues that matter most to Black Americans.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. So Prison Journalism Project trains incarcerated people inside prisons in the US to be journalists, and we publish their stories on our website, as well as in partnership with publications, other publications, including many newsrooms. And so what we're really trying to do is to build this pipeline of prison journalists, help create room for more prison journalism, and really bring about this ecosystem for more voices that have traditionally not been heard in journalism.
Okay, great. So let's jump into some questions. So Cristi, I'm gonna start with you. So as you said, you founded Global Press 18 years ago. How have you seen the global reporting landscape change in that time? And what more needs to be done?
I love that question because it gives me the opportunity to actually talk about something good that is happening in journalism. And actually so much has changed in the last 18 years. 18 years ago, when I founded Global Press, I was boldly suggesting that local women around the world could and should be the storytellers of record. That the number one way for us to better understand the world was to change the storyteller, change the person who was telling us the story so that we could break out of these rote narratives. And people looked at me like I was out of my mind. In part because mainstream media narratives had never allowed for the possibility that women in rural Democratic Republic of Congo were powerful journalists in their own right, that women in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia could actually tell stories that would change the way international and national policies were made. Over the last 18 years, this idea is mainstreamed. Our world is full of not just extraordinary local journalists, but extraordinary local women journalists who are doing this work every single day, who are working in national newsrooms as independent freelancers, and who are really owning the work of narrative change. That being said, more definitely needs to be done. Women remain underemployed in most journalism markets across the world, and safety and security issues for women journalists in the world are profound, complex, and never-ending. So there is definitely more to do when it comes to building representation and proximate storytellers. We have to make sure that these journalists have the jobs that they need, but also the safety and security mechanisms in place to continue to not just create narrative change in fleeting windows and moments, but we really need to think about what makes narrative change sustainable. And high-quality journalism and safety and security is what really has to be the next step.
Thanks. Okay, next Akoto. Capital B emerged during the pandemic. Why was that the right time to launch? And what have been some of the big learnings you've learned?
Yeah, so we made the decision, or the idea for Capital B was born in June 2020. I don't need to remind everyone what was happening during that time. Pandemics, protests, which ended up being global protests about racial inequality. And, it was June 12th, actually, and I sent a very not productive text to a friend, Lauren Williams, who is my co-founder and was also chief executive at Vox.com, about our frustrations. We just talked about the ways that, the industry had, failed to make their newsrooms diverse, failed to elevate and listen to the Black journalists in their news organizations. And the result of that is, part of what is, the result of that was really evident in that moment when we were, grappling with all of the racial tensions in the country. And so we decided that then was the right time to, while mainstream media was sort of grappling with its own, how they sort of helped to fuel this environment, we realized that those changes would take a while to undo, and we needed to do something more urgent. And so we launched Capital B, and I think, we launched Capital B with the bet that Black consumers wanted news from different Black perspectives, and they wanted to understand what was happening in the country from people who looked like them and understood their lived experience. And what we've seen since we've launched is that a lot of that is true, right? We've surveyed our audiences, and they've told us that they feel seen, they feel valued, that they get fresh perspectives from us that they wouldn't otherwise see in mainstream media, and that they're also impacted because they get to read about issues that they didn't know were relevant and pertinent to their lives. And so there's still a ton of work to do, but I think the Capital B just sort of underscores the importance of really thinking differently about like what audiences have value.
Great. Okay, and Yukari. So Prison Journalism Project is also a newer nonprofit news organization that's emerged in the last few years. Why is it so important that audiences hear directly from incarcerated writers?
Yeah, so just to tell you a little bit, we also launched during the pandemic, really as a grassroots. It really started with an idea, really very organically. The pandemic happened. We just saw that everybody was talking about it as a historical moment. And there were a lot of outbreaks in the US happening inside prisons, which are essentially locked boxes. And we thought that we wanted to find out what was going on. My co-founder and I were teaching inside prisons, and so we knew people and we didn't know what was happening to them. And then 2 months later, George Floyd got killed, and the stories just started changing. And it really began as a passion project, a volunteer project, and then we realized by summer, this moment of, holy cow, there's so much inside, and they're great stories. We're missing this whole element in this world. And I want to just share with you some statistics, a few statistics about our very broken US prison system. We often talk about how the US is about 4% of the world's population, and we hold about 20% of the world's incarcerated population. Over half of this country, according to an organization called Equal Justice Initiative, has a family member or a relative who is or has been incarcerated. That's over half of the US population. And of course, the biggest communities that are impacted are Black and brown people, and so it's a very unequal system as well. And so there's a lot to unpack there. The other fact is that because we're a federation, we have 50 states. Each of them have their own system, prison system, plus the federal system, and so there are a lot of issues and challenges and problems, and there are a lot of people that are impacted. There are about 2 million people who are incarcerated in prison in the US, and so these are the stories that are getting missed, and they're all tied to at least half of the US population.
All right, so let's get into audience and how your models think differently about serving your readers. So each of your models is focused on the importance of proximity in meeting the needs of your readers. Let's spend a bit more time digging into each of your models and how you think differently about your audiences and how to serve them. So, Akoto, I'm going to start with you. So Capital B is a national news organization that is rooted in community and designed specifically to serve a Black American audience. Can you tell us a little bit more about your model? How is it different from other perhaps more mainstream or traditional national news outlets with regional bureaus? And what does it mean for you to be writing specifically for a Black audience?
Yeah, so, Capital B exists to, produce meaningful, accessible journalism for Black communities across the country. We're only 2 years old, but the idea of that is not new at all. Our roots are very deep in the legacy of the Black press. The first Black publication launched in 1827, so almost 200 years ago, right? And it's the same story that it is now, that those publications and the hundreds that came after it were launched in response to the ways that mainstream media were not equitably serving Black citizens, right? And so we were born in that legacy, and what's true for us is that, one of the frustrations that was really like sitting in our face in 2020 is that even when there's good journalism about Black Americans or important consequential work about systemic racism or any of the issues that our communities face, it is always in explanation for other people, right? Mainstream media has incentives to reach broad audiences, and explaining things to broad audiences is their prerogative. And that is all true, but Black people are the ones who have to live and deal with all of the things that are so broken in America, and being a resource for Black people, reporting for them, was really, really critical. So that's really the big difference. And in terms of our local audience, I think our local newsrooms, what is really important and what really drives a distinct difference there for us is that all of our local newsrooms have a community engagement practice led by a community engagement editor whose primary job is to just be with residents wherever they are, neighborhood meetings, meetups, community events, talking to them, listening, understanding, what their questions are, what their curiosities are, their concerns, and then bringing that back into our newsroom and letting it fuel our journalism. So it's not that we only do stories that way, right? Like, journalists often have very good instincts about what makes a good story and what information needs to be uncovered. But I think what makes Capital B special is that we are listening to Black residents and responding, doing journalism that's responsive to the things that we're hearing.
Mm-hmm. And could you also say a little bit about how you find your reporters and what kind of training you might offer as they join your newsroom?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, for a young newsroom, what we found as we were, doing our recruiting and trying to launch is that we encountered a lot of really talented and early career young journalists, and it was important for us to be, yes, a place of employment where they could, feel good about the work they were doing, but also a place where they could be trained and nurtured, and be conduits for a improvement of coverage of Black Americans overall. And so our reporters, get to go to trainings. They have different sort of, arrangements with different editors, and there's a lot of attention put on their development.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Okay, Yukari. As you were mentioning, we could spend the full 50 minutes trying to explain the dysfunction of the American criminal legal system, and we wouldn't even be scratching the surface here. But with that in mind, can you provide a bit more context for your work, and in doing so, explain why PJP is necessary and how it's different from other newsrooms that may report on the criminal justice system in the U.S.?
Yeah. There's been, I think we've definitely been inspired and by a lot of the really good journalism work that's been happening around this space. The Marshall Project, you might know of. ProPublica has done some great stories. The Appeal, a lot of organizations are doing a lot of great stories, but they're all from the outside fundamentally. And these are places with communities. They're vibrant. People. I mean, unfortunately, in the U.S., people will serve decades of a sentence. So they are places where people live and work and have friendships, and their deaths and birthdays and the pandemic and all of that, right? And so there's a story that is missed, and I think that, my co-founder Shaheen and I, we really had this feeling that, also as BIPOC, as women of color ourselves, that journalism has historically done not a very good job of bringing in all the voices, and you lose a lot story-wise. And so for us, the challenge was, first of all, that you're working with people who are not trained journalists, and so we have to train them. And so very much we're rooted in training journalists. We just announced, we've been spending 18 months working on the first journalism textbook for incarcerated people, and it's a 3-certificate program. And so, they can get certificates in beginner, intermediate, advanced, and so there's a fundamentals of journalism that is a shared understanding with them in newsrooms. And so what we're really trying to do is to, we do have a publication. We see it as a sandbox. We see it as a place where they can train, but fundamentally we want them to be writing stories and delivering stories with credibility and impact in newsrooms. So we partner with them as well. And a lot of them are local because prisons are local places. And where their stories are going to have the most impact is in those areas. I mean, they are part of the community, whether the community recognizes it or not. And so we train them. We don't lower the bar. We work with them so they can meet the bar. And then we send those stories out, and just to give you a couple ideas of the stories that can come out. We had a story we worked with Al Jazeera English last fall on how Muslims in New Jersey state prisons are getting cremated against their religious beliefs, and that was a powerful story. And the state is now reviewing how they handle all religious burials. The impact can also be really personal. Somebody writing about what winter in Pennsylvania is like. somebody in the administration's read that and moved him to a better prison, a prison that he'd been trying to get into for the last decade. And so, they can have all levels of impact. And what we're really trying to do is to shift the narrative and make sure that these voices are included. And I think that's what we're all doing fundamentally, is to bring in voices that have not traditionally been included by journalism, and I think our experience is that it only yields to good things. I mean, it's always adds more meaning to the best stories out here too.
Great. Okay, and Cristi, you mentioned that your reporters do reporting for both their local community as well as for global audiences. And of course, MacArthur supports you because a lot of your content makes its way to the U.S. And we often hear the critique, I'm sure you do too, that Americans aren't interested in news from outside of the U.S. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you know about the kind of international news people are interested in hearing about, and how global press is helping to meet that demand?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the most beautiful through line, I think, of each of our work is this fundamental notion that people have a right to recognize themselves in stories, right? And the beauty of the way each of us has put our newsrooms together is this notion that when you build a representative newsroom, there is an evidence-based correlation between who works in a newsroom and who is quoted and featured in stories, right? So by building really intentionally representative newsrooms, we are building more representative news products. So at Global Press, yes, we focus a lot on the local audience in the communities that we cover, and we work really hard to meet our audiences where they are. Every single story at Global Press for the local audience gets its own distribution strategy. We might say for one story it needs to be a radio piece, another piece a reporter might need to go on TV. In some of our more restrictive markets around the world, we've started buying billboards, and we'll tell a news story on a billboard on the street. So give us a surface and we'll tell you a story on it. For the international audience, it's interesting, because I think that there is this sort of notion that, people are so fatigued with just like the bad news stories from around the world. And that is really true, right? And there is no shortage of bad news in this charming world of ours. But what's really interesting is that reader preferences are demonstrably changing. 2 years ago, we ran a nationwide study in the United States with a public service research firm called Goodwin Simon Strategic Research, and we asked them to poll Americans across the country to actually try to get to the heart of why do they read or not read international news. And the findings were fascinating, because one thing that we found was that a lot of people weren't really aware of a diversity of content that existed when it came to international news, right? It was just sort of like war, poverty, disaster, disease, repeat, like turn on CNN, see a volcano erupting, open the front page, like see like some horrible thing happening somewhere else, blah, blah. In the survey, we started exposing participants to other types of stories, and we started byline testing. So we would show people in focus groups a story about Zimbabwe, for example, written by a well-known foreign correspondent, a story about Zimbabwe written by like a wire service, and then a story about Zimbabwe written by a local journalist. And we asked focus group participants, okay, which one do you prefer? Almost everyone, they had 10 seconds to answer the question, almost everyone was like, oh, famous foreign correspondent for sure. Then the moderator said, okay, I want you to think about what you would get from your foreign correspondent that you would or wouldn't get from one of the other reporters. And this time they had 30 seconds to think about it. And in those 30 seconds, 88% of people changed their minds. And they started saying things like, this Zimbabwean reporter, she looks like the people in the photographs. I bet she could tell me something that these other news organizations couldn't. I'm going to read the piece a little bit closer, and I think that she's going to help me understand this issue differently. She's going to help me understand it better. It's not just going to be the same rote narrative. She has the proximity, and she has the access to tell me a different story. Y'all, that 88% blew my mind. I had never had such faith in America, because it is really, really telling, right? It tells us that we are in a moment where audiences are smart, and audiences are also willing to question systems and structures of power that have, long sort of let everybody just assume that the news that was chosen for us was the news that we need to read. But now, given the opportunity to consume more proximate, more representative news, it is increasingly what people want, and that's super exciting.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Okay, let's pivot to duty of care. So, working with new kinds of storytellers, especially those who come from directly impacted communities, brings with it new kinds of responsibilities to ensure their safety and well-being. It also means that your reporters may not have formal journalism training for, especially in particular, Cristi, in your newsroom and Yukari's newsroom. I'd like to turn now to discuss your approach to caring for your reporters and newsroom staff and how you help prepare them to be effective reporters. So Cristi, can you tell us about Global Press's Duty of Care program and why it's important?
Yes, absolutely. It is, I think, of everything we've built in the last 18 years, the most important thing that we've built by far, because I think when you are intentionally going into a community and training up a population of people that oftentimes with Global Press do not have prior experience in journalism, it is extraordinarily important to make sure that you are delivering holistic duty of care services. Physical, emotional, digital, legal security, that's part of the newsroom package. So what we do at Global Press is we really look at duty of care from a risk mitigation and a care perspective, right? There are so many organizations in the world that do an amazing job counting dead journalists, and that's so important. However, we really want to think about what does it look like when journalists covering the hardest stories in the world from some of the hardest places in the world are not just not dead, but also safe and well. And in order to do that, we put a series of risk mitigation strategies in place. There's a ton of training, but really, duty of care is alive in day-to-day policies and protocols in the newsroom. We don't have a head of duty of care at Global Press. Duty of care is written into every single person's job description, right? It's how stories are commissioned, it's how stories are assigned, it's how reporters travel for stories, it's how people are paid. It's reimbursement policies. It's all these little things that go an extraordinary long way to help keeping journalists around the world safe. Those risk mitigation practices are followed up with services. We have built something inside of Global Press called the Global Press Wellness Network, which is a network of counselors, mental health professionals who speak the language of all of our reporters, and our reporters, who are all full-time employees at Global Press, have unlimited access to these counselors for one-on-one counseling. Over the last 5 years, 80% of our journalists have taken part in some kind of one-on-one counseling. In parts of the world where one-on-one counseling isn't culturally the norm, we offer group sessions, wellness workshops, a variety of ways to make sure that reporters are really informed about things like secondary trauma, stress, anxiety, et cetera. So making sure that those day-to-day policies, protocols, and practices are followed up with care and support services is really what makes the duty of care promise whole. And people ask me all the time, oh my God, like I would love to do that, but it's so expensive. It's not inexpensive, but it's also not like the millions of dollars that you think it is, right? One of the things that we do at Global Press is we write in a 3% duty of care budget line to every grant that we ever write. And so over the years, that 3% has snuck up to the point where, yeah, I do employ 24 wellness counselors. Yes, 80% of my reporters do have access to care. Yes, we do have legal services in every single country around the world that we work. So I think it's really about reframing security as not we do the journalism and then the security is when like shit happens afterwards. It's rethinking security, how it's integrated into the whole organization, which also really helps with covering the cost.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to jump over to Yukari because I know that this is a special challenge for you and the writers that you work with. And I know that you worked with Cristi to develop your duty of care program. How do you apply duty of care in your work, and what do you do to ensure your reporters and storytellers are prepared for work with PJP?
That's a big question. We think of primarily the safety of our writers in an emotional context, legal and physical. they don't have internet access, so digital is less of a concern. And so those are the three that we prioritize. And we worked with Cristi to really build that foundation. Again, everything starts with training, and so, and that's an ongoing process because we're just starting, we're still building capacity, like you can only do as much as you can do. But we do think it's important that that there's transparency, that the writers themselves are aware of what their capacity for risk is. And so in our textbook, we do have a page that it's a quiz that helps them assess their own capacity, and then it guides them towards certain categories. So if they have very little capacity for risk, we'll suggest, maybe do a book review and review how prisons are portrayed, or do a profile, or there's so many stories that they can still do. And then if they have high capacity for risk, then we worry too much about getting in over their heads. And one of the first things that we learned was that in prison there's prison police. And so the consequence of doing journalism that prisons won't like can also mean basically being taken in for questioning and being demanded about who your sources are. And so it's, new problems all the time. We spent a lot of effort, particularly on their emotional safety, because all of them carry trauma with them. They're somewhere they all carry mental health issues. If they didn't have them going in, they have them by living in that environment. We work through that in a couple main ways. One is that our editors are very careful about the way they edit. We joke about the compliment sandwich, but it goes a lot deeper than that. Really being transparent, being crystal clear about what changes you're going to make in a story, why, giving them the option to push back if they want, if they're feeling strongly, if they start feeling like it's not their story, and one of the things that my senior editor always talks about is having that humility. This is ultimately their story, so if they really have a strong opinion, we give it to them, because it's their, we're here as supporters. So that's one way. And then the other way is that we have chosen, so the way we work is most of the stories come handwritten, and so they have to be transcribed. We have volunteers who do that. We go through many rounds of editing because they're still learning. And all of this happens either through letters, through prison monitor digital communication systems, and occasionally by phone. And we have a team called Writer Relations, and they are responsible for sending and receiving all of the communications. And so they are just handling dozens of pieces of information and back and forth all the time, because there are memos, editing memos going to them, submissions coming to us, responses to editing memos coming back, and they keep on top of all of that. And then they also stay on top of the 50 different rules and regulations around communications. And they take care of our writers. We've published over 700 writers. We have about 2,000 in our database. And the writer relations team is a small team. It's one manager and a contract assistant. They're both formerly incarcerated, and so they really understand what's going on. They're there to see. We ask them to read the memos, read all the communications, so they can flag something for us if there's an issue with the way we're trying to communicate something, or if there's an issue the other way. Something that might appear small might not be so, and vice versa. And so we're really trying to make sure that it's not, it doesn't feel extractive, and that we're building a community, because we're really cognizant that we're outsiders here. We're trying to help. We believe that their stories matter. And so we're really trying to do all of our work centered around the writer and the kind of stories they want to tell, and then helping them develop as journalists, which, without feeling so bad about themselves, which, the editing process can sometimes do.
Great, thanks, Yukari. Okay, so Akoto, you mentioned, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but could you please describe for us your approach to hiring at Capital B? And what do you value most in your reporters? And how does Capital B think differently about what it means to be a reporter in the communities in which you work?
Yeah, I also just got to say, this is the second time we've done this panel, and I'm always so inspired to hear you two talk about duty of care. I think it's so important and just a thing that we should all really adopt and embrace. So yeah, when I talked about us launching in June 2020, all those things were happening. But the other thing that was happening was that a lot of Black journalists were talking about their own experiences in American media and how hostile it had been, right? And so, you know, as much as Lauren and I thought about the kind of editorial product we wanted to have and about how we were gonna fund that work, we also thought about very deeply about the newsroom culture that was gonna help to sustain all of that, right? And so one of the things that we really tried to push back against is that in startup culture, there's a lot of pressure, right? Like, you often hear founders and like team members at startups talk about being a family, right? And we have published guiding principles on our website for anybody to see, people who want to work for us, people who are just curious. And our second guiding principle is that we want people to prioritize their own health and the health of of themselves and their families. And part of that is reminding folks that, like, we're a team. We are not a family. You have families and they need you to be okay. And messaging that, you know, this is a workplace. When we're here, we do really, really important work, but we know that there are other things that are happening in your life and in your world that need your attention. And we also know that you need space to handle those things in order to show up 100% at work. And so that's sort of like the culture we're trying to build. It's hard to do remote, but that's really the ethos, that, right? Like, just not sort of repeating, I think, many of the newsroom cultures that we grew up in, where it's like grind to no end, and like, hopefully you get some acknowledgement for it, right? So we really want people to feel safe in that way and take advantage of our, you know, liberal time off policies. Also, leadership tries to model in small ways how to just take care of yourself. My therapy appointments are on my calendar in the middle of the day, because that's when my therapist is available. And there are plenty of leaders and colleagues who do that in our newsrooms. And, you know, there is a lot of joy to be had in Black life. I'm Black. I love being Black. It's great. There are also, you know, there's a lot of stuff that we have to report on, a lot of injustice across so many different aspects of life, and that can really, really weigh you down. And so we really encourage folks to acknowledge that, like, this is heavy, and quite often, because we're often reporting on injustice, that, like, it might be disproportionately heavy for us as a newsroom, and that being able to just acknowledge that and say that and be transparent about that, I think, has really helped to foster a place where people feel like they can be their full selves at work, and then in turn bring their full selves to their reporting.
Mm-hmm. Great, yeah. Before we turn to audience questions, I just want to give the three of you an opportunity. Is there anything that you want to make sure the audience knows about your models, your work? Any final piece of advice before we turn to their questions? And, you know, I'm going to throw one question out there. Even if there's, you know, an example that you can share with us about, you know, what happens when people recognize themselves in the media that they're consuming.
Yeah, I certainly can. I mean, I would say my number one piece of advice to people is always to check the byline, right? Understand whose story you're reading. That is the title of my book that I published last year. Is the byline is so important, right? Understanding who is writing the stories that you're reading is extraordinarily important. And what happens when journalists do that is in just how stories are sourced at Global Press, we teach reporters that lived experience is actually as valuable, if not more valuable, than credentialed expertise. And so what happens when people recognize themselves in stories is that they trust the news product. And when they trust the news product, they use the news product to make more and better choices, live freer, fuller lives. So there is a direct line between representation, trust, and building a more just and informed world. So it is not simple, but it is also not rocket science.
Yeah, I mean, that's our theory of change, right? That by listening to community members and by doing work that's responsive to that maybe folks can see the power of journalism and at work in their lives. Maybe they start to trust not just us, but other credible media, and then maybe we just build Black trust between communities and journalism overall, and that's really important considering all of the threats to, to the way that we consume media. And I think that is sort of centering listening as a big part of the way that you execute this work is really critical.
I think so much of our business is about telling stories, about people that from the outside, right? And so just taking that moment to think about to give space to stories from within that community. We've built an entire organization on how we can support stories about a community by the community, and that's been pretty powerful. I mean, we're also now thinking about, what kind of stories would be for the community that they could do themselves. But when you empower, journalism is not like sometimes it feels really complicated, and of course it's very difficult, but it's really not that simple. It's about telling stories that people haven't heard about. And I'm here to say that people who haven't been trained can be trained, to provide that space in your communities, people who haven't had the opportunity, and see what happens, because I'm willing to bet that it's going to be a story you have never anticipated. I mean, I'll just tell you, just to give you a small example, so we started right after George Floyd was, right before George Floyd was killed, and then a year later, the officer who sat on his neck was convicted. And we decided that night that we were going to send out a request to all the writers we were connected with on the digital communication service and ask them to do people on the street interviews, like talk to the people around you and we want to hear what they're thinking about this conviction. And, we got a lot of this, what you would expect, relief, joy even, but I was really surprised that we got sympathy. And so we got several responses back from interviews that said, I wouldn't wish solitary confinement on my worst enemy. It is inhumane. I've been there. Some of them, I've been in for 10 years or more, and I don't wish it on my enemy, and I don't wish it on him. And there was this pity and sympathy, and I didn't see that anywhere else. And that really, I've never forgotten that.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Okay, let's turn to the audience for your questions. I think we've got a couple of microphones here. Yes.
Is it working? Yep. Hello? Yeah. So my name is Marie. I'm from AFP, Agence France Presse, and you talked a bit about Wire before. I was wondering, have you been approaching news agencies before, or about how to make the newsrooms in news agencies more diverse, or are you planning to do so in a way or another?
Yes, absolutely. It's a huge piece. So I think each of our models, republication and making sure that other news outlets not only have access to our work. I think for us at Global Press, we get asked all of the time, literally twice a day, by mainstream media outlets if our reporter in XYZ location can be used as a fixer because XYZ foreign correspondent is coming to town. The answer to that has been no every single day for the last 18 years and will continue to be no, because there is just a better way, right? And there is so much deeply important foreign correspondence going on in the world right now. So that's not to belittle that, but I think for us, what we really want to do is help publications understand how publishing stories with a local byline helps people to really create a more informed world and really helps people better understand the world and their places in it. So all republication from Global Press is free in all 7 languages that we publish in, and so we work really hard to make sure that our stories go in the most impactful place possible.
I think one of the really awesome things about the nonprofit space is that the idea of competition is just different, right? We're not like competing against each other, we're competing against forces, right? Like misinformation, racism, right? And all that stuff is, I think that's just for me, it's been really rewarding to be grounded in that. And so that means that like, when you're coming from that perspective, yeah, you'll partner with anyone. You like share the reporting. If you read it at Capital B, great. If you read it at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, great. It's important work that we want to see out there, and I think the way that nonprofit news sort of nurtures that is really important in this time.
We also do partnerships, but one of the programs that we've been, we're planning is what we're calling a professional development program. And so, we've only been around for 3 years, but some of our writers are starting to come out of prison, and they've been caught by the bug, and they want to keep doing this. And there's presently no pipeline for them to have jobs in the media industry. It's just there's so much, right? For some of them, just knowing where the on button is on a computer is going to be something that has to be taught. And so we've been thinking a lot about what kind of professional development training can we provide a year, let's say a year before they come out. Journalism is also just great general professional development training because you learn how to communicate in writing, speaking. Also, the really most valuable point is that the editing process is a critical process, and so they learn how to receive criticism and make a product better. And so we're trying to really, formalize that. And part of the idea is that we would create a fellowship and we would partner with local newsrooms. And the newsrooms, hopefully would benefit because they would get that. They would get that diversity. I think another way of thinking about people who came out of prison is bringing socioeconomic diversity into the newsroom. I mean, this is an industry that is traditionally very well educated, has people who came from a lot of privilege, and so if you can bring in formerly incarcerated people who are going to be much broader in age, much broader in educational background, and come from maybe some communities that they haven't connected with before, then that can only be good as well.
Thank you, all of you. My question is actually specific for Yukari Kane. Having worked in detention centers in the United States also, well, first off, I wanted to know if you have reached out to detention centers also. And also, I wanted to ask you, I'm assuming that you have had difficulties in accessing, and not all the institutions are the same. If you could talk a little bit about that part in accessing really and making this available for detainees, these options.
Yeah, for sure. We have definitely thought about the detention centers. The challenge with the detention centers is one, language, but B, the bigger challenge is that they are so vulnerable and the consequences are so high. The consequences are high in the prisons as well, and one of the things that I tell my editors is everybody knows that there's no story that is worth more than somebody's future. And so we will drop stories if that threat we feel is too big. But with the detention centers, they're just so vulnerable, and we haven't figured out how we're going to be able to support that yet, and so we haven't. We've gotten some interest before. In terms of, just overall, you wouldn't be surprised to know that the number of writers, the representation in each state is almost proportional to how open the state is for writing, for publishing. So California, Washington, Michigan are big. There's some mighty states. Texas has a very tough corrections environment, but we have quite a number. They're fearless. The harder ones are places like Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, and Georgia. We're really we're treading very carefully on, and we don't have an overall strategy. I think each case is different. In Georgia, we recently connected with a prison education program. And one of the teachers there is unbelievably a judge. And he's kind of like, I really want to bring your program in. And we're thinking, we should stick close to this judge and see what happens. But really play the long game. And just take, not be afraid to take one step forward, 2 steps back. Like we just, we definitely don't want to be responsible for somebody's future, being put in solitary is really bad, but that's not the worst that could happen. I mean, they could be denied parole. They could, there's so much that could happen, right? We had a writer whose mail, he just didn't receive any mail for 2 years during the pandemic. And we would try sending things by certified mail, so we'd have the signature of the prison, we know it's there, and he didn't get it. Until he wrote a story about how some officers brought in COVID and created an outbreak, and the governor's office investigated, and all of a sudden his mail started up again. So I think that's the power of journalism.
All right, well, we have run out of time, unfortunately. We'll be here for a few more minutes so if you have any burning questions for the panelists, you can come up to us after we end. But let's thank our panelists for such an interesting conversation. And thank you, all of you, for being here.